Hi, Dawn. Thank you so much for being willing to come and talk about this.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, Dr. Natalie. You have helped me so much over the course of the last 21 months.
Just so Careblazers know, Dawn was in it was the grief group last week.
Yes.
So we were inside of our grief group that we hold inside of our program. And Dawn's mother, who you have been caring for how many years?
Business wise, for about 8, and then locally, first with her living with us for 8 months, started 3 years ago. And then for the last 21 months, she's been in a care facility.
Yeah. And she passed away how long ago now?
May the 24th.
And inside our grief group, we were talking about, we had a mix of people. We had people who had just lost their loved ones. And then we had people their loved ones were still alive, but they felt like they were getting closer to losing their loved ones. And in that conversation, you were there and you said something that just stopped all of us in our tracks. And you said, it's really important to be prepared for and talk about the business of death. So let's just kick it over to you, Dawn. Talk about what you meant by business of death and your whole experience in, going through the process of your mom dying and arranging the funeral and dealing with all of the business stuff.
We tend to think of death as being an emotional event, which it most certainly is. But even as you're going through the emotions, even as you're dealing with the grief, there are business questions that you have to deal with immediately. There's no delaying it. There's no saying, can we just talk about that next month or something like that? There are some things that you have to deal with immediately with the funeral home. A lot of those things can be planned for in advance if you need to. Things like, where is your loved one's service going to be? Are you going to be having services in the same town where the death occurred, or are you going to have to transport the body? If you're going to transport the body, this was one thing that was, a real confusion for me, is that she died in one place. She was going to be transferred 6 to 7 hours to the location where the burial was going to take place. That was where the funeral was going to take place. But I did not know. I knew which 2 funeral homes were communicating with each other. I knew which one picked her up from the care facility. I did not know whose responsibility it was to do the embalming, to do the transportation. Were they going to drive her from Austin to Lubbock and then them drive back? Or were the ones in Lubbock going to come and pick her up and then drive her back to Lubbock? I didn't know how any of that worked. And I called to the place that I was dealing with in Lubbock and said, I just need some basic information. I'm not sure about the logistics of this. And they transferred me over to one of the funeral directors. And she said, we take care of everything. You just don't worry about it. And I said, well, I am worried about it because there are some things that I have to prepare for and that I need to take care of here, or do I need to take care of there? And who's going to do the embalming? And she said, you just don't worry about anything. We've got all the information. We're going to deal with the other funeral home. Don't worry about anything. So I hung up and I stewed for about 5 hours worrying about everything. And I thought, this just doesn't work for me. And so I made out my little concise list of questions of things I felt I needed to know. And I called back and the woman answered the phone and I said who I'd talked to. And she said, well, it turned out they had 2 employees by the same name. I didn't know which one of them I had talked to. And so she said, well, I'll put you back in touch with this one. I think this is who you talked to. And I said, really, I would prefer to talk to somebody else because I didn't get the answers I needed. So she sent me to somebody else and I went through and I was like, who's going to transport the body? Is the embalming going to be done here? There's a woman here who's been doing my mother's hair for 30 years who wants to do that as a last thing of honor for her. When is the transportation going to take place so that can be arranged beforehand? And she systematically went through and answered all my questions and we were fine. Interestingly enough, whenever I actually got to the point of having a funeral director assigned, they were going to assign the first woman I had talked to. And boy, it's amazing how learning all that I have learned from you, how empowered I have become. And I said, I've had communications with her that didn't go real smoothly. So if there's somebody else that I can have as the funeral director, I would prefer to do that. I need a communicator. And so they said, hold on just a minute. And I wound up getting Jolene, who was absolutely wonderful to work with, and it made things so much smoother. Again, I think that you've got to empower yourself with knowledge and don't be so concerned about being polite that you don't have your needs met, because the focus should be on you. at this point in time, not on somebody else.
Yes, I love that. And you shared a couple of things that you had already had done that made the process go smoother as you were planning the funeral. Can we talk about those things that you already had done just so other Careblazers can maybe think about doing that right now?
I had gone last fall to the cemetery whenever I was out in Lubbock on business and had asked them to please look up the deed. My grandfather bought the plot for everyone in the family, all of his brothers and their families, as well as his own and my great grandparents. And so all of that was done in 1947. So I knew where she was going to be buried. I didn't have to go through the process of making that decision, but I just wanted to make sure that all the paperwork was in place, that there wasn't anything specifically that I needed. I was the executor, I was the power of attorney for my mother, and that this was the person who was going to be placed and all of that. That was a big load off. You know, I knew exactly where she was going to be. She and her sister had already had a discussion of who was going to be in what place before my aunt passed away. That was already predetermined. I knew exactly where she was going to be. We had done a 90th birthday celebration in her care facilities, and the activities director there had recommended that I do a slideshow, which I was just like, there's no way I'm gonna have time to put a slideshow together. And I started looking around her house, and lo and behold, I found albums I had never seen. And so about, I'd say 6 weeks to a month, as we were seeing that the decline was definitely taking place, I told Stephen, I said, what we did for the 90th birthday is a start, but it's not enough. And so we just took several evenings where I would go through and I would pull out pictures and I'd hand them to him and he'd scan them in and got them all on the computer. And so we had all of that done. That is one of those things I could not have done out there. If I had not done it here, we would not have had access to the pictures. There was no way that I could have gone around the house picking up all the albums and, loading those up in the middle of trying to get ready to go. So that was a huge thing that I was really, really glad. And when you are planning a funeral, when you're sitting with your funeral director, there are so many different options and you choose what you would like and what you wouldn't. I went ahead and chose doing the slideshow presentation to do during the visitation, and then you get that on a disc or on a Fire Stick or whatever. So that's something that you have, and it was beautifully done. That was something that we had under control in advance, and I was very glad that we did. I had clothes in the closet that were going to be appropriate for her burial. I had a mixture of seasons represented, not knowing when that time would come, so that it wouldn't be dressing her for spring if it was the middle of winter, that kind of thing. Both of our sons were here, and I said, okay, now is the time we're going to choose what mother's going to be buried in. It felt a little odd to be having this conversation, but by this time hospice was involved. We did have a good handle of where we were in the process. And so I carried out 5 outfits and showed them, and amazingly, all 4 of us agreed on which one was the right one. Wow. And so that was that. And then I happened to, like 2 days later, I thought, I haven't looked at that really closely in bright light to be sure that there's not a spot on it or anything like that. Sure enough, there was. So I had plenty of time to be able to get it washed and have it hanging up and drying. And then I had it in plastic, a dry cleaner bag that I had on hand, and all of that was ready to go. One thing that's important that I did not know that came as kind of a surprise to me, you need everything to dress them, everything to the funeral home. So you have bras and panties and socks, shoes. They are completely dressed. At least in Texas, that is the law. Men will have undershirt, underwear, socks, shoes, pants, suit, tie, whatever you choose to as the clothing. Unless you are of a faith that uses a burial shroud, you will be expected to bring the clothing, and that clothing will need to be a complete outfit. So that was one of the things that I did, is that, I didn't get just the outfit that we had picked out. It was everything to go with the outfit and what shoes and all of that kind of thing that could be done together. That was one of the questions that I had for the funeral home was, did I bring that with me to go and take it to them, or did I leave it with the funeral home here? And they told me it was my choice. And so I chose to transport it myself and just not run the risk of it getting left in a hearse or in the room somewhere down here and not having it up there and all of that. So it was just one of those things that it was like, I could tick off the box.
Do you think there's a particular time when people need to start thinking about this and taking these steps to help prepare?
Certainly, as you are seeing the disease progress, the more you're seeing the disease progress and you're recognizing how much harder it is just to deal with the day-to-day decisions and the day-to-day care that you're doing, then realize that as hard as it is now, it'll only get harder as it continues to go on. And the more that you have, and you can have a box, you can have, a suitcase, you can have something that as you go through the list of things to be done, you put everything in one place, and then you know that when the time comes, you're going to pick up that one bag and it's going to go with you to the funeral home to talk to the funeral director, and you're prepared. You don't have to start scrambling to find things at the last minute. And especially if you're trying to deal with the logistics of family members coming in and you getting yourself ready, and if there's travel involved and all of those different kinds of things, it just is overwhelming. And for me, I'm an only child. So there's myself, my husband, and my two sons, and we had to do everything. So everything that I could get done in advance made it that much easier because there was nobody to delegate to.
Yeah, no, that's amazing because there's so many little things that add up to be so much decisions about everything. And it's a lot to think of on the spot. Like you said, you don't have a lot of time to think about it. You just have to decide and let them know. You mentioned like choosing the outfits and everything, that it felt unusual. It felt strange to go through that process. I'm wondering if that was your experience with a lot of these preparations ahead of time. Your mom's still alive. Like, what would you say to somebody who wants to take some preparation to make things less hectic when their loved one passes away, but they're experiencing a sense of, well, this feels strange. They're still alive. How did you work through that?
Past experience. I was responsible for taking care of things whenever my aunt passed away, and her daughter was supposed to have brought clothes for her for the funeral, and she forgot. And I was suddenly scrambling, going shopping for clothes that to me looked like my aunt and the colors that looked best on her. And my mother was physically ill with grief. And here I was my mother was with me. And I looked across the store and saw that she was just ghost white, pale, and was wobbly. And I thought, my Lord, she's going to faint, and I don't have anything picked out. And they were already calling me from the funeral home saying, we need this here by 2:00. And I'm looking at my watch and it's 12:30. And I'm thinking, and so I had to scramble and, take her to go get a pedicure and a manicure from somebody that did it, so that for her that knew her. I'd never met these people in my life. I just pulled in. I'd gone to get mother some coffee at Starbucks, thinking that might help, caffeine might help. And she said, oh, that's where I get my nails done. I said, really? Let's go. And I pulled in. I said, you wait right here. And I rushed in and, said, this is my situation. And my mother's in the car and I need for y'all to take care of her over the course of the next hour and a half, because I have things I have got to do. Going through just the extreme stress of that and trying to feel like I was choosing something appropriate for my aunt and doing right by her. I also was planning the funeral for her. She was an Episcopalian. My husband and I are Episcopalians. Nobody else in the family is. So thank goodness I knew the prayer book to go by, and I knew to call the diocesan office to get a priest. But there was just so much I was trying to deal with, and clothing was the last thing that I wanted to be thinking about at that point in time. So that past experience of going through that panic and feeling like I wasn't sure I was doing the best I could have done for my aunt was a major motivating factor that for my mother, I was going to have it put together.
And so I love that you shared some of the things you did ahead of time to help prepare. A lot of it sounds like based on your past experience. What were some things that you wish you would have done earlier, that you could have done earlier, that maybe other Careblazers can do as they start to think about their loved one eventually passing?
I think that probably the most important thing was deciding on scripture readings, deciding on music. I did a lot of that after I was already in Lubbock, and we were right before Memorial Day weekend. We were having a problem getting a hold of a minister. The church that I planned to go to, that my mother had been baptized and christened in and had confirmation in, that minister had just had knee surgery. And so that was off the table. My mother appreciated what I'd done for my aunt, but she made it the only real stipulation that she gave me of anything about her expectations for her funeral was that she wanted to have a Methodist minister and have a Methodist funeral. It was a matter of scrambling to try to find somebody. That a lot of the churches had Memorial Day events, and so calls weren't being returned and that kind of thing. And so I went into a meeting with my husband and a minister that I'd never met before, and we were literally like less than 36 hours before the service.
Wow.
And so that was high stress. And I was, in preparation for that, after I knew who he was going to be and that all that was going to be done, then I was scrambling to look and see what Bible readings do we want to include? What music do we want to include? For me, I listened to recordings. I decided on hymns that came to mind, and I got online and I did searches on YouTube, and I found in Pandora, and I found recordings that most appealed to me, and some of them that were of the time period of my mother's life that she would have been the like original recordings that she probably would have listened to. It worked out really, really well, but those are things that I wish that I had gone ahead and gotten done beforehand.
Now, you shared a very beautiful story about the flowers and at your mom's funeral. Do you want to share that?
My mother and I attended with a friend a floral design course years ago, like about 40 years ago. And one of the things in the class, one of our exercises that we did during the workshop was that we pulled little bio pieces out of a hat of our particular person that we were preparing a casket spray for. And then they had a trunk full of all kinds of different things in the trunk that we could go in and we could find things that kind of went with the biography of the person that we were doing. And so a really important theme of that course was to personalize, don't just go in and do a standard FTD number, whatever, personalize it so that it has meaning to the family and it is reflective of the individual that you're preparing it for. So I had really been struggling with this, and I knew the person I wanted to do the flowers for me. She's a young woman that I've known all of her life. Her mother is one of my dearest friends and was my two sons' pre-K teacher. And she also went to the Benz school. Mother, whenever she decided that was what she wanted to do, mother wanted to help her go. And so that was something that we all shared in common. And so I was struggling with it, and I thought, I don't want to put her in a difficult situation. And could they travel all the way from Dallas Fort Worth to Lubbock and all this? And I thought, you know what? I'm just going to call her. She's going to tell me if it won't work. And so I called her, and she was thrilled that I had called and asked her. It happened that I had at my home in Dallas Fort Worth a plant that we had gotten out of the cotton field last year. And so my son took it. And so she had cotton that was from our family's farm. She got wheat because whenever we had our ranching operations and farming operations in Oklahoma, wheat was our main crop there. I talked to her and made the arrangements for her to get the things that we needed. I also had knitting needles because that was one of her favorite hobbies. And she had consistently asked me to be able to bring her knitting. And the last time she tried to knit, she was very frustrated. She couldn't do it anymore. And so that was important to me to have that represented. And so it was a very personal representation, and it was a gift of love from Emily. And it was a comfort to me every time I was looking at that arrangement and knowing that that had been done specifically and that represented her. And we had a very small service. That was my choice. I didn't want a lot of people there. She was 91, so a lot of her friends were already deceased or would have had a very hard time getting there. We did have one of her best friends all the way from high school whose daughter had brought her, but most of them were cousins and people that my mom had worked with and that kind of thing. It was very small in a chapel, so it was a very intimate setting. And there was just something about knowing that had been done specifically for her that gave me a lot of comfort.
I love that. And the funeral home, they offered you different choices of flower arrangements. But again, it's another example of you speaking up and saying you wanted something different.
Right. And, whenever I said definitely I wanted it to have red roses, those were her favorites. And so they showed me the standard and I was just like, I'll go with the private florist. And Emily had two different kinds of red roses. I'd never seen one of them that was kind of a frilled rose, and it was absolutely gorgeous. And so there was depth in it. And she had filler flowers that were in a pink and maroon, and she just did an outstanding job. And it was a very special thing.
I love that. Anything else coming to your mind? Now, again, we're going to have an entire PDF you can download with so many questions. I mean, I was looking over this list and I'm like, oh my gosh, I would have never even thought about some of these things. So that will be an incredible, comprehensive resource. But anything coming to you now, Dawn, that you want to make sure other Careblazers hear about or think about or do as they are eventually their loved one will pass away.
I think that the business aspect, as far as the funeral home is concerned, there's some things I was not aware of. And fortunately for me, it wasn't an issue because I had been putting money into a savings account that I called my death fund that was going to be to cover everything that we needed at that point in time. So I was prepared. But if you don't have that, there are people who have life insurance policies that they think will pay for the funeral. That is not the case. Life insurance does not pay out to funeral homes. There is, at least in Texas, and I would think that this would be likely in a lot of places, you have to have the service completely paid for within 48 hours of the service time so that they have time to get the check deposited and it to clear and all of that. So if you have not prepared in advance and don't have the funds available, then that's going to be a real pressure point. You need to go ahead and kind of think about what kind of casket you are interested in, what is important to you as far as the material that it's made out of. My mother was one who loved natural wood, and so we went with a natural pecan. I didn't like the metal ones. Funny story, my grandmother was looking at cars. This was when I was in college, and there was this really pretty baby blue car that we all thought she'd love, and she said, absolutely not. That's exactly like a coffin, and I'm not driving around in a coffin. And so at that point in time, it's like in my mind, it's like see a metal coffin and remember grandmother saying those words. So we also got a wooden coffin for her as well. You need to know whether burial is something that's important to your loved one, or would they prefer to be cremated, or would they prefer to have their body donated to science, or do they want to donate organs beforehand? If you are not going to have an open casket and you're going to have the service in a very short period of time after the death, you don't have to have the body embalmed. But if you are going to have a visitation, a showing, or there's going to be a time lapse, then you do need to have the body embalmed. One of the things that I'd never thought about was that Jolene told me that there are families who think they can't have a visitation or a casket at a funeral if they're going to have their loved one cremated. That's not true. You can make arrangements with the funeral home that they can have a service, have the visitation. They have caskets that are set aside for that purpose. So you basically rent a casket for that period of time, and then that's how that side of the business is taken care of. I think that going through and having as much of those discussed with the family and knowing what you want to do, then that kind of at least gets you started when that call comes to say, okay, this is the funeral home that we're going to. This is what we want as far as the body is concerned. This is what we want as far as the preparation of the body and all of those details that are so important. And if you are of a mindset that you can go and get that done with pre-planning, then you take care of all of that ahead of time. They have everything in the files and you don't have to worry about that. Another thing is the obituary. Now, this was particularly who we dealt with as far as Dignity Memorial, but they have a booklet that covers all the questions that they need to know. And you can have the person who's at the funeral home write the obituary for you. I didn't choose to do that. I chose to do it myself. If you think about it, you can do everything that's going to be done in obituary ahead of time, save it on your computer or have a hard copy of it. And then all you have to do is fill in the details of the time and the place and the services and all of that. Another thing that they're going to ask you to decide is where do you want the obituary published and when? And I did not want it published in advance because I was basically calling the people that I felt would want to be there and that I wanted to be there. I didn't want to just put it out. Plus, there's always the risk, especially living in a rural area, that if it's publicized when the funeral is going to be, there's going to be an assumption nobody's going to be at the house, and that can be a problem situation. So I just ask that it be published only the morning of the day of the funeral. And then as far as the newspaper in the small town that she actually lived in, that wasn't published until Sunday because they only publish the newspaper twice a week. There are all of those kinds of details. You can have a lot of that done ahead of time. This was the service leaflet. So having the picture picked out, I had a quote container that I do this for our Careblazers. I have a folder in my photos that is condolences. And so I just, whenever I see something that I find meaningful that I think would be helpful to a member of our Careblazer family at that point in time, then I put that in the folder. And then whenever we have the announcement of a death on any of our groups, then I can go through that folder and see what I think is most appropriate. So I was able to go through, I had multiple quotes that I presented to my husband, to my sons. My sons both agreed on one. My husband and I agreed on the other. And so we wound up putting one on the inside and one on the outside. And then the obituary was in there as well.
Yeah.
To the minister, then we did an insert, and that included who was officiating, the welcome and greeting, the songs, and then the words of comfort. He did a remarkable job of weaving in. He had never met my mother. We only met him the day before. And I was thinking, how is this going to go? If you have any pet peeves about things that you have experienced at funerals, then just verbalize those. For me, I don't like going to a funeral and they give you the obituary in the service flyer, and then the officiant stands there and reads it to everyone who's there. And it's like, we've been reading it while we were waiting for this to begin. It just seems almost insulting to the family and friends that are gathered. And so I told him, I said, just please, everybody who is going to be there has known my mother either her whole life or their whole lives. And so they don't need any of this. So please don't just read the obituary. And we had chosen Ecclesiastes 3:1-8. A time for every purpose. And he read that, and then he said, so let's look at the roles and purposes that Joy fulfilled in the course of her lifetime. And he started at the very beginning of her playing in the wheat fields of Oklahoma, and he went all the way through of her educational career, her professional career, her work in the family. And my husband and I looked at each other when he said the last prayer and the last music, and we just looked at each other, and I said, that was perfect. And my husband said he nailed it. It was very, very meaningful. So don't be afraid if there's something that is going to be particularly comforting or meaningful to you. Don't be afraid to verbalize that and express that this is something that you want included in the service, whether it's from the minister or from the funeral director. Just,
Yes.
customize it to be. Remember that you are honoring your loved one who has died, but the service is for you and their loved ones. The only people that you have to really please or worry about are those of you who are grieving. Everybody else who's there is there as a guest, and your loved one is already departed. So it is not selfish to include the things that are going to bring the most comfort to you.
Thank you for that perspective. I love it. Has this experience with your mom changed anything about how you and your husband are planning for your funerals?
We already have pre-planned ours. I had a very dear friend who passed away. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She had not planned her funeral, and I went through that with her husband and her son, who was a senior in high school. And I came home and I told Stephen, I said, we just got to do this. We just got to. We have already done our pre-planning, but we plan to be cremated. And we are not sure. We know where we would like to have our ashes placed, in a columbarium at the church where my husband grew up and where we were married and all of that. We aren't positive that we can actually have a space there in the columbarium. So that's something that we've got to check out. But, basically we've got everything else done. And as far as the service is concerned, I'm going to make notes after this experience and have them to share with our sons, and then say, if this isn't going to be meaningful to you, then don't worry about it. Basically, as Episcopalians, we have a script that's going to be followed in the prayer book anyway. And so there's less that has to be decided as far as that's concerned. So it's going to be basically where they are, at what stage of life they feel for their needs to be met is going to be the most important thing for me with them.
Well, I so appreciate you coming here and talking about this topic. I don't think we've ever had a topic on funeral planning and arrangements ever. So when you brought this up in the grief group, and then you said you'd be more than happy to share, I'm just so appreciative for it. Again, I'll be sure that we link that document that you shared with all of us below, so that people can access that for free to help guide them through some questions. And I think if anybody is watching and wants to take away a big takeaway, it's the way you advocated for yourself, for your mom, and what you wanted, standing up for what you wanted in a very respectful way at a time that's really important for you and your family. I think that's lovely. And I hope other people have the courage to do that too.
Well, and I will tell you, Dr. Natalie, I also had to do that with hospice. The first hospice group that I'd chosen, I had emphasized over and over again, the most important thing was communication, and that I had excellent communication with the care facility and everybody who was there. And I would rather not have hospice come in than to run any risk of messing that up. And within 2 days, I was getting comments from the RN saying, they're not talking to us. They're not telling us. And I tried to do the bridge and say, I told you this was what was most important. Things did not improve. And so the fourth day, I said, this isn't going to work. I told you I'd rather not have hospice at all. And then I brought another hospice group in, and they were there for the last 10 days. And the communication is the number one thing. And I could not have asked for a better situation. And a lot of that, of knowing about hospice, knowing what they should be doing, what they shouldn't, and all of that came directly from the teachings that I've had through Careblazers. So you have made a tremendous difference in this journey, and I am forever grateful.
Well, I'm so honored to have you as part of our Careblazer family, and just you continue being a part of our family, and I love that. And so just thank you so much, Dawn. I really appreciate this.
Absolutely. And my best to all of you. I know that this is a hard thing to think about and to face the reality of, but it's a gift that you can give to yourself as well as to your loved ones, to be able to do the planning for your loved one with dementia, and then think about the planning for yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity.
You're welcome, Dawn.
Also, Nico gets a belly rub for every person who subscribes from this video. So if you haven't already, click the red subscribe button. It's totally free. And Nico says, thank you very much.